The investigating directorate against corruption says they are engaging with Dr Malusi Gigaba, but he will not appear in court today. Gigaba appeared at the IDAC offices this morning in response to what he said was a summons from the National Prosecuting Authority to do so. The charges allegedly relate to the procurement of locomotives and other procurement activities at Transnet during his time as Minister of Public Enterprises. I'm now joined by Michael Marchant, Head of Investigations at Open Secrets. Michael, a very good afternoon to you, and thank you so much for your time and for joining us. So what do you make of the summons that were given to Dr Malusi Gigaba and his appearance at the IDAC offices this morning?
Good afternoon, Katlego. Thank you very much for having me on the show. I think that it's certainly an important moment. One of the reasons that it is so important is that it's one of the few times we've had so far in all of the cases that have come up regarding state capture, where you have someone who was a senior minister at the time and was making decisions at the ministerial level being brought into the case. So that's certainly important. There are a range of Transnet state capture cases at various stages of their process currently before our courts. And so I think the addition of someone who was a minister and someone very senior at the time, like Gigaba, is incredibly important. What I will say, though, is that, of course, there's still so much about this that we don't know at the moment. So when the news broke this morning, we thought that we might be having a conversation now about what the charges are, because we thought there may have been a court appearance. There still has not been. And so because of now the uncertainty, I guess, around what the questioning and discussions will be, there's still some uncertainty, certainly on my part, about precisely what the charges are and exactly the range of conduct of Gigaba's that it might concern.
Michael, Open Secrets during the time of the Zondo Commission consistently used its investigations also just to put pressure on the Commission to also call up individuals as well as certain companies and agencies to appear at the Zondo Commission. And you were some of those that have been calling for the Hawks and the NPA to prosecute some of those that had been involved. So what's your take on the slow process of the law taking its course in many of these that had been found in the Zondo Commission?
Well, Katlego, I think you're right. It's one more case, I think, of a very slow process on the part of law enforcement. I think we need to wait for the charges to understand precisely when law enforcement, and particularly the NPA and the Hawks, could have acted upon this. But I think the fact that if we broaden the scope beyond the question just of Malusi Gigaba and his conduct as minister, the fact that despite the fact that there have been several arrests over the last 3 years in relation to the locomotive procurement at Transnet, I think as your show was discussing just before I came on, we haven't actually seen those cases go anywhere. And so I guess the public will be feeling this way about this update regarding Gigaba as well, is that we as the public have seen lots of arrests, lots of appearances at police stations, and lots of appearances before court to hear charges. What the public hasn't seen, and what they remain, I think, very frustrated by, is we've yet to see any of those cases go from that stage to the stage of a hearing. There have been some that have been struck off the roll. There have been one or two, maybe infamously, that were unsuccessfully prosecuted and then appealed. But especially when it comes to Transnet, we haven't yet got to the stage where the merits of a case can actually come before a court and we can have a decision and ultimately some direct accountability for conduct that was incredibly damaging to South Africa. And we shouldn't lose sight in all of this discussion around the individuals that Transnet in particular is such an important case given the amount of money that was involved. We're talking ultimately about a 16 billion rand escalation, billions of rand funneled outside of the country via front companies in Hong Kong. And that money was not only lost to South Africa and lost to the public, but contributed to the long-term decline of Transnet as a state-owned enterprise. So there's also that public and social cost that remains, I think, at the heart of the frustration with South Africa's public at the lack of progress towards accountability.
You speak, Michael, of the public sentiment around cases such as these. What message does it send out to some of those officials that are still sitting in places like Transnet, where many of these cases are still just hanging, and just that constitutional obligation obligation of the state to investigate and really bring many of these cases to close?
So I think that Katlego, it's a good question, and I think there's a mixed message in a sense. So as I've just said, some of the delays are deeply problematic, but I think on a day like today, we should also say the opposite as well, which is that it's very encouraging that for someone who's been a senior politician for many years, who in many ways has enjoyed the protection of the ANC, his party, who, maintains a very senior position on the NEC, but also as a member of parliament. In fact, a sitting head of a standing committee in parliament on defense, a very important position. And the fact that law enforcement have taken these steps, we're not, again, precisely sure what the charges are, but the fact that they would take those steps against someone like this is exactly what the public and civil society have been calling on for so long. And so I would say again that there's a bit of both here, is that there is a frustration that it's taking a long time and we're yet to see too much progress. But this type of day is also encouraging because it should be a reminder for all of those people still in these positions that the pressure remains on, not just from law enforcement, but also from us within civil society, that these cases, even when they do take a long time, there is no reason that they cannot still be acted on. And so arrests, charges, and ultimately prosecutions should still should still be coming for so many people who have yet to be prosecuted for their involvement in state capture.
And do you think that the findings and the recommendations from the Zondo Commission just reinforce that obligation for the Hawks and the MPA to fast-track some of those corruption cases, specifically the Siangen as well as the Suifambo related to Transnet?
Completely. I think that so in terms of Transnet, just a point of clarification, I think that Siangena and Swifambo was in relation to PRASA, which is another incredibly important state capture matter related to trains, just on the side of passenger rail. But if you look on the side of Transnet, it is a really important reminder, Katlego, that these steps taken against Gigaba seem to be directly related to the findings of the Zondo Commission. And the Zondo Commission was very clear that Gigaba had been incredibly close to the Guptas and that the evidence before the Commission on the balance that it saw suggested that Gigaba had acted at the behest either of the Guptas or then President Jacob Zuma to make appointments at Transnet that enabled that capture to take place. And so I think, there's been a lot that's been said about the Zondo Commission over the years, but what we're still seeing today, that the progress that is made, albeit far too slow, still stems from the really incredible investigative work and important findings that the Commission made. And this is one more, I think, piece of evidence that those findings are still very powerful and that so many of them still need to be acted upon.
And do you find that pressure from civil society organizations have helped in any way in fast-tracking some of these processes?
Well, we would certainly hope to say yes, absolutely. I think that in South Africa, what we often speak about within Open Secrets and civil society is that the news cycle is very difficult to keep up with all the scandals. And there is scandal fatigue, and I think there's also public fatigue at the systematic extent of corruption and systematic issues within law enforcement, which are before our screens every day now with the Madlanga Commission. What that means is that when things fall out of the immediate news cycle, it does fall to organizations in civil society to maintain the pressure, so that when law enforcement doesn't act or when regulatory bodies don't act, it really does come down to organizations in civil society, including Open Secrets, to prompt those regulators, to remind them of findings, to contribute new investigations. And I think that, the continued progress towards accountability is testament to the fact that not only at the time of state capture and the Zondo Commission did journalists and others within civil society contribute towards accountability. But as you've said, it's the ongoing need to apply that pressure on the agencies and bodies that are supposed to do so.
All right, Michael Marchant, thank you so much for your time. We're still to know, like you mentioned, the charges that would be laid against Malusi Gigaba, if any. But thank you for joining us. That was Michael Marchant, who is the head of investigations at Open Secrets.